He was smiling under the lights, while, according to people who worked near him, his body was already keeping a private account of every hour stolen from rest. In the dressing room, there were damp towels, a half-finished cup of tea gone cold, and a shirt carefully arranged to hide the strain that cameras were never meant to catch. If the audience had known what was being whispered behind the door, if they had seen the pale face before the makeup, the trembling hand before the handshake, the myth of the cheerful working actor might have cracked in one night. But the papers were fed safe little stories, the studios protected their schedules, and Tony Berry, the man with the weathered face and the honest eyes, kept stepping forward, as if pain were just another line in the script. Who decided what he was allowed to say about the conditions he endured? Why did silence seem to follow him more faithfully than any agent? And what was written, quietly and coldly, in the paperwork that made a beloved performer swallow the truth for years? Tony Berry, born on the 28th of August, 1941, in Ipswich, Queensland, was never the sort of star who entered a room like royalty. He did not float in behind a wall of assistants, sunglasses, and rehearsed arrogance. He looked like someone who had lived, worked, worried, laughed too loudly in pubs, and carried other people's stories in the lines of his face. That was his magic. Audiences across Australia and New Zealand trusted him because he seemed incapable of fakery, even when he was acting. On screen, he could be a mate, a father, a rogue, a bruised survivor, a man who had seen too much and still held the door open for someone else. In Goodbye Pork Pie, the cult road film released in 1981 that made his face unforgettable to many, he became part of a national memory, a kind of rough and tender symbol of rebellion, humor, and stubborn hope. Later, in dramas and character roles, he carried that same lived-in truth. He did not need grand speeches. One tired glance from Tony Berry could tell you a whole broken history. And yet, the cruelest irony is this. The man whose face told the truth for a living was, according to several industry whispers and accounts from people close to working actors of his generation, often trapped in a world that rewarded silence. Not silence as dignity, not silence as privacy, silence as a condition, silence as a clause, silence as a legal shadow lying across the table before a job could begin. To understand why that matters, you have to remember the world he came from. The film and television industries in Australia and New Zealand were not always the polished machines they later pretended to be. They could be intimate, brilliant, chaotic, underfunded, and ruthless all at once. A performer might be treated like family during a shoot, then treated like a disposable invoice once the cameras stopped rolling. Berry belonged to that tough generation of actors who did not complain in public because complaint itself could become a stain. If you were known as difficult, the phone could stop ringing. If you spoke too clearly about long hours, poor accommodation, late payments, dangerous set conditions, or contracts full of traps, you might find yourself suddenly described as unreliable. The punishment did not always arrive as a shouted threat. Sometimes it arrived as nothing at all. No call, no audition, no explanation. That is the social contrast at the heart of his story. Fans saw premieres, credits, interviews, smiling photographs, the glow of a national treasure being embraced by ordinary people. Behind the glow was a working man counting the days between jobs, signing pages he may not have had the power to challenge, and walking into rooms where the people with money spoke softly because they knew the law was on their side. The public saw applause. The actor saw the fine print. And fine print can be more frightening than a slammed door. According to sources familiar with entertainment contracts of that era, confidentiality language was often broad enough to scare a performer away from discussing almost anything that embarrassed a production. Conditions on set, disputes over payment, injuries, medical difficulties, broken promises. The wording could sound respectable, almost boring, until a lawyer explained what it might cost to test it. Imagine Tony at a kitchen table after a long day, spectacles low on his nose, script pages beside a contract, the glow of a lamp making the paper look yellow and tired. A role is waiting. Rent is waiting too. Pride is waiting. The signature line sits there like a dare. If he signs, he works. If he refuses, someone younger, cheaper, and quieter may take the role by morning. That is how a system silences without needing chains. It places a hungry artist in front of a door and says, "You may enter, but leave your complaints outside." And because Tony Berry loved the work, because acting was not a luxury for him but a calling, he kept entering. There were triumphs, of course. We must not rob him of those. He had the rare privilege of becoming familiar without becoming fake. Viewers recognized him the way they recognized a neighbor's voice across a fence. He built a career not on scandalous glamour, but on credibility, on presence, on that battered humanity that no acting school can manufacture. But triumph can be a beautiful mask. While audiences admired the face, they rarely asked what it cost to keep showing up. Later in life, Berry faced serious illness, including the devastating loss of part of his leg after a long battle with melanoma. That fact is public, and it reveals something essential about his character. He continued to work, to appear, to give, even when life had already taken from him in a way that would have broken many stronger men. But before that visible hardship, there were quieter ones. The private exhaustion of an actor who had to prove himself again and again. The pressure to be grateful for whatever was offered. The humiliation of being treated as replaceable by people who depended on his talent to make their projects feel real. The industry praised authenticity, then often refused to hear the authentic complaints of the people creating it. According to associates who have spoken broadly about the culture around him, there was a phrase actors learned to fear. It was not always spoken as a threat. Sometimes it came wrapped in politeness. "You understand this must remain confidential." Such a soft sentence, such a velvet glove. But inside, it was the fist of reputation, employment, and legal cost. Was Tony Berry directly forbidden in every instance by one sinister document waved under his nose? According to all available accounts, no single such document has ever been confirmed. The truth is likely more complicated and more chilling. Systems rarely need one villain when they have habits, lawyers, producers, budgets, fear, and 1,000 quiet compromises. A man can be gagged by a contract. He can also be gagged by knowing how the room will change if he tells the truth. This is where the ticking clock begins, not at the end of his life, not with the final headlines, but decades earlier, in the repeated decision to endure instead of explode. Each job demanded stamina. Each silence became easier for others to expect. Each swallowed protest taught the machine that Tony Berry, decent Tony, dependable Tony, would keep going. And the strange thing is that the more beloved he became, the less free he may have felt to complain. A struggling actor can shout and be ignored. A known actor can shout and become a headline. A national treasure can shout and be accused of ingratitude. The system turns love into leverage. Picture the audience clapping after a screening. People line up to shake his hand. They tell him what his work meant to them, how he reminded them of a father, a brother, an old friend. He smiles, perhaps sincerely, because he loved people and he loved story. But somewhere behind that smile, there may have been a second voice whispering, "If only you knew how they treated us to make this." That is the first locked room in this story. Not a room of scandalous romance or glittering excess, but a room full of contracts, fatigue, medical strain, and fear of being punished for honesty. In the mythology of entertainment, Actors are paid to pretend. In Tony Berry's case, the most painful performance may have been pretending that everything behind the scenes was fair. So when we ask why Tony Berry did not publicly tear the curtain down during his most productive years, we should not imagine cowardice. We should imagine pressure. We should imagine a man from a generation taught to keep working, keep smiling, keep faith with the crew, and never hand enemies a weapon. We should imagine the legal letter that never needed to be sent because the possibility of it was enough. And if he was already carrying private pain, already learning what his body could and could not endure, then the silence becomes even darker. Because a sick or exhausted actor is easier to control. He needs the job. He needs the insurance of future work. He needs not to be labeled troublesome. The machine does not have to hate him. It only has to use him. But there was another question hiding beneath the medical strain and the public affection. If Tony Berry was working so hard, if his name carried such affection, if audiences remembered him for decades, why did the life of a respected actor still feel so financially vulnerable, so dependent on the next contract, the next handshake, the next permission to speak? And who benefited from keeping that question out of sight? The most unsettling thing about Tony Berry's career is not that he earned too little in the way tabloids love to scream about vanished fortunes. It is that he gave the impression of cultural wealth while living inside a profession where real security could slip away like water through old floorboards. There were credits, there was recognition, there were beloved roles that audiences carried in their hearts. But affection does not always pay a medical bill. Nostalgia does not always protect a working actor when the phone stops ringing. And if fans had known how thin the cushion could be beneath a familiar face, they might have looked at the whole industry with fury rather than admiration. Where did the value of those performances go? Who collected the long tail of love, broadcast, rerun, and reputation? And why were the people who created the magic so often left counting coins in private? The vanished inheritance in Tony Berry's story is not a chest of jewels disappearing from a mansion. It is something more subtle and, in some ways, more brutal. It is the inheritance of a lifetime's labor that should have meant protection, comfort, leverage, and the right to speak openly. For many character actors of his era, fame existed in public, but power remained somewhere else. Their faces became part of a nation's emotional furniture. Yet the ownership of the work, the residual streams, the contract advantages, and the legal shields often sat in offices far from the set. This is where the old glamour begins to rot. A fan sees an actor on the screen again and again and assumes the actor must still be rewarded each time the memory is revived. But depending on the contracts, the period, the production structure, and the bargaining strength of the performer, that assumption can be painfully wrong. An actor can become immortal in reruns and still be chasing the next paycheck. A line can become famous while the person who said it gets only applause. Tony Berry's appeal was built on ordinariness, but that ordinariness may have made the exploitation easier to hide. He did not present himself as a fragile golden idol. He seemed tough. He seemed practical. He seemed like a man who could take a knock and make a joke about it afterward. The industry loves such people because they do not look like victims. But toughness is not consent. Endurance is not fairness. And a man who smiles through pressure is not proving the pressure harmless. He is proving only that he has learned the cost of objecting. According to people familiar with the old working culture around independent productions, some actors accepted punishing conditions because everyone was told the same romantic story. The budget is tiny. The project matters. We are all in this together. Do it for the art. Do it for the country. Do it because this could be the one that changes everything. It sounds noble until you notice who gets to own the result. The crew gives up sleep. The actors give up comfort. The older performers lend credibility. Then, if the film survives, if it becomes beloved, if it travels, if it is sold, celebrated, revived, and mythologized, the sacrifices are remembered as charming hardship, while the contracts remain locked away. That is not romance. That is a business model wearing a sentimental coat. There is always a figure in stories like this who appears at first to be helpful, not necessarily a monster with a curled lip, not a cartoon villain, but the reassuring professional who knows the forms, knows the producers, knows what can and cannot be said. In Tony's world, this role could be played by agents, production representatives, lawyers, or executives, depending on the job. The face changes, the function remains. They are the ones who say, "Trust us, this is standard." Standard. What a dangerous word. It can make a bad clause sound inevitable. It can make a frightened actor feel foolish for asking questions. It can turn a gag order into housekeeping and a warning into advice. The snake on the chest does not always hiss. Sometimes it smiles and places a pen in your hand. We should be careful here. This is not about naming a living person as a villain without evidence. It is about exposing the type of machinery that surrounded actors like Barry. The smooth gatekeeper, the friendly negotiator, the budget keeper with sympathetic eyes, the person who insists there is no problem until the actor wants to speak publicly. Then the warmth drains from the room. People who have worked in entertainment know that a threat does not need to be dramatic to be effective. It can be a short note mentioning obligations. It can be a reminder of confidentiality. It can be a suggestion that public comments may damage professional relationships. It can be the quiet fear that one honest interview could become the reason the next producer chooses someone else. For Tony Barry, a performer whose strength lay in being believable, this must have been an especially cruel trap. His public identity was truthfulness, yet the professional survival code demanded that he edit himself. He could tell the truth through invented characters, but perhaps not about the real conditions under which those characters were made. And the public, hungry for the finished product, rarely asked to see the bill. They saw a man they loved and assumed the love came back to him in security. But celebrity is not the same as wealth. Recognition is not the same as ownership. A familiar face on screen can still be economically exposed, especially in industries where funding is unstable and character actors carry prestige without always carrying bargaining power. The contrast becomes almost unbearable when you imagine two rooms on the same night. In one room, an audience laughs, applauds, and feels proud that local storytelling has produced something genuine. In another room, after the celebration, an actor folds his suit over a chair, checks messages, wonders when the next job begins, and knows that even if he has grievances, voicing them could cost him more than he can afford. One room is full of warmth. The other is lit by a single lamp and the cold arithmetic of survival. That is how an inheritance vanishes before anyone can steal it. It is drained through weak contracts, through buyouts, through one-time fees, through unpaid emotional labor, through the expectation that beloved performers should be grateful for being remembered. And when illness or age enters the story, the cruelty sharpens. The body grows more expensive to maintain, just as the industry grows less willing to insure, wait, adapt, or listen. Tony Barry did not live as some tabloid caricature of wild mansions and golden taps. His story is far more relevant to ordinary viewers. It is about the terrifying possibility that a person can be admired by thousands and still have to fight quietly for dignity. It is about the difference between being treasured and being protected. The public treasured him. Did the system protect him? As his career stretched on, the affection around his name deepened. Younger actors knew him as a veteran. Viewers recognized him instantly. He could walk into a small role and make it feel inhabited. That gift should have been a shield. Instead, in the wrong hands, it became something to exploit. Dependable actors get called because they do not cause trouble. They finish the day. They hold the scene together. They carry pressure like old luggage. And behind that dependable image, the private ledger continued. Hours worked, conditions endured, words unsaid, questions swallowed, contracts signed because the alternative was uncertainty. Every time he accepted the silence, someone else learned that the silence could be demanded again. The saddest kind of missing fortune is not money alone. It is the missing freedom to tell your own story while you are strong enough to tell it. It is the missing public record of what really happened on sets, in negotiations, in those supposedly ordinary moments when actors were reminded that gratitude was safer than honesty. It is the missing testimony that could have warned younger performers before they walked into the same trap. So when we ask where Tony Berry's inheritance went, perhaps we should not look first for a bank account. We should look at the contracts that turned living work into someone else's asset. We should look at the culture that praised his authenticity but punished authentic complaint. We should look at the people who smiled beside him in public, while behind closed doors, the rules of silence remained untouched. And then we must ask the more dangerous question. If Tony Berry, with his beloved face and his decades of respect, could be kept cautious by legal language and industry fear, what chance did the unknown actors have when the same papers were slid across the table? Only a small circle ever truly understood how much Tony Berry had been carrying, and according to those who described the old industry from the inside, that circle knew exactly why silence was profitable. There were the people who saw the tired arrivals, the delayed payments, the hotel rooms that did not match the promises, the shoots that stretched beyond what bodies could comfortably bear. There were the professionals who knew which clauses frightened performers and which phrases made them retreat. If the public had heard the conversations that happened after the smiles, the myth of the happy film family might have curdled instantly. Who sat in those rooms and decided that the show must go on no matter what it cost the people on screen? Who understood the strain and still protected the brand? And why did the truth need a locked door, a careful email, and a circle of insiders guarding it like contraband? Every industry has its clans. Some are made of blood. Some are made of money. Some are made of shared guilt. Around beloved performers like Tony Berry, the clan was not necessarily one fixed group meeting in a dark room, but a recurring formation of producers, representatives, legal advisors, broadcasters, funding bodies, and old hands who understood the unwritten law. Keep disputes private. Keep the performer grateful. Keep the production clean in public. Keep the story away from the audience. This is why the phrase film family can be so treacherous. On set, people do form intense bonds. They eat together, freeze together, wait through endless technical delays together, and share the strange intimacy of making emotion on command. Tony, by all accounts, had the warmth and humor to become part of that temporary family wherever he worked. But family, in the entertainment business, can become a word used to make workers accept what no proper workplace should demand. A real family does not usually hand you a confidentiality clause before helping you. A real family does not remind you that speaking about pain may breach an agreement. A real family does not treat your loyalty as an asset and your honesty as a liability. Yet actors were often expected to believe that silence was proof of loyalty. Berry's career unfolded across a changing screen culture. The rougher, independent spirit of earlier decades gave way to more formal structures, more paperwork, more international attention, and, often, more sophisticated methods of control. What had once been settled with a handshake could later be wrapped in legal language. That did not always mean better treatment. Sometimes it simply meant exploitation learned to wear a tie. In the public imagination, the actor is the powerful one because the actor is visible. But visibility can be a trap. The people who control schedules, edits, distribution, references, and reputations may remain invisible, while the performer becomes the easiest person to blame. If something goes wrong, the actor is emotional. The actor misunderstood. The actor is bitter. The actor should be grateful. This is how a clan protects itself without needing to announce a conspiracy. Everyone knows just enough to stay quiet. The lawyer knows the clause. The producer knows the budget corners. The agent knows which battles are unwinnable. The broadcaster knows which stories are inconvenient. The actor knows he is the one who can lose work fastest. Tony Berry's public persona made him seem immune to such games. He had that rugged, unvarnished presence, the kind that suggested he would call nonsense by its name and walk away. But real life is more painful than fantasy. Walking away from one bad job is easy in a story. Walking away from an entire network of future employment, at an age when roles are already narrowing, is another matter entirely. There were moments of brilliance that remind us what the system was feeding on. Berry could enter a scene and make younger performers look grounded. He could bring moral weight to a modest production. He could take a line that might have seemed plain on the page and make it sound as if it had been sitting in his chest for years. That kind of talent is not decorative. It is structural. It holds the house up. And yet the house often belongs to someone else. The actor's face sells the emotional truth, but the contractual power sits in offices, in production companies, in distribution agreements, in legal archives where the public never looks. That imbalance is the hidden villain of this story. Not a single mustache-twirling enemy, but an architecture of permission and punishment. According to accounts from people close to the working realities of the screen world, actors were sometimes warned that public criticism could damage not only a project, but the livelihoods of everyone connected to it. This is a particularly effective form of pressure because it weaponizes decency. A man like Tony Berry, who cared about crews and fellow performers, would not want to hurt others, so the system could place the burden on his conscience. If you speak, you harm the family. But what if the family had already harmed him? What if the demand for silence was not protection, but concealment? What if the real scandal was not one bad shoot or one harsh contract, but a whole culture that trained decent people to protect indecent arrangements? Here the domestic shadow returns. Imagine him at home after being praised in public, surrounded not by luxury, but by the ordinary objects of a working actor's life. Scripts with folded corners, notes from productions, old photographs, medical appointments creeping into the calendar, the body asking for mercy while the profession asks for availability. The phone can feel like salvation when it rings, and judgment when it does not. That is the private cruelty of precarious fame. You are known enough to be recognized in the street, but not always powerful enough to dictate humane terms. You are admired enough to be called a legend, but perhaps not secure enough to refuse a job with bad conditions. You are loved by strangers, yet forced to negotiate with people who may treat love as proof that you will do the work anyway. As Berry aged, the clock grew louder. Older actors often face a narrowing corridor, fewer parts, more typecasting, more assumptions about stamina, more pressure to accept what is offered because the industry has a cruel habit of calling people treasured only after it has finished taking them for granted. In that corridor, confidentiality can become a muzzle disguised as professionalism. There is also the matter of pride. Men of Tony Berry's generation were often taught not to speak too much about hurt. They joked, they deflected. They turned hardship into a story, told lightly over a drink. Public complaint could feel like weakness, and the industry knew how to exploit that old masculine code. Keep your chin up. Do not make a fuss. Be a good bloke. But silence has a cost. It isolates the person who suffers. It protects those who caused or tolerated the suffering. It leaves younger workers without a map. Worst of all, it allows the public record to become a lie by omission. Everyone remembers the finished film, the beloved role, the warm interview. Almost nobody remembers the clause that kept the darker paragraph unwritten. And that is why this story matters now. Tony Berry was not merely an actor with a long career and a familiar face. He became, in this telling, a symbol of the worker hidden inside the star. The man who looked free because he was famous, yet may have been boxed in by contracts, expectations, illness, age, loyalty, and fear of legal retaliation. He was not silenced by one hand over his mouth. He was silenced by a room full of polite hands holding documents. The Klan thrives when everyone believes there is no Klan. It thrives when each bad condition is treated as an exception, each warning as normal, each gag as standard, each exhausted actor as merely dedicated. It thrives when the audience is encouraged to love the product, but never ask about the worker. Tony Berry's tragedy, long before the final chapter of his life, was that he gave audiences truth while being denied a safe way to tell his own. So we begin with the forbidden question. Not whether Tony Berry loved acting. He did. Not whether audiences loved him. They did. The real question is whether the industry that profited from his honesty ever allowed him the same honesty in return. And if there were people close enough to know the answer, people who saw the paperwork, heard the warnings, watched the exhaustion, and understood why he kept quiet, then what exactly are they still afraid to reveal? There is a document that no fan ever sees. It does not appear in the credits. It is not framed on any wall. It sits in a filing cabinet, or perhaps a legal archive, and it contains the real terms of the arrangement. Not the romantic version, not the press release version, but the version with the clauses that begin with words like notwithstanding and the party agrees not to disclose. According to people familiar with the standard contracts circulating through Australian and New Zealand productions during the peak decades of Tony Berry's career, these documents could run to many pages of language that a working actor, under financial pressure and eager to begin, might sign without fully understanding the trap inside the courtesy. One former production assistant, speaking broadly about the culture of that era rather than any single production, described the signing ritual as almost ceremonial. The papers came out, the pen was offered, the smile across the table said, "This is normal," and the clause that said, "You may not speak about this," was buried so deep in the language that it looked like furniture rather than a cage. Who decided that the people who made the work should be the last people allowed to describe it honestly? The road film that made Tony Berry's face part of a national conversation was shot under conditions that, by some accounts from people who worked on independent productions of that period, were said to be far from the comfortable mythology that surrounds beloved films in retrospect. The year was 1981. The project was lean, ambitious, and fueled by the particular energy of people who believed they were making something that mattered. And they were right. The film endured. It became a touchstone. It was the kind of work that gets screened at festivals decades later, while the audience nods with the warm recognition of a shared cultural memory. But memory is selective. It keeps the laughter and the open road and the feeling of freedom. It does not always keep the long days without proper rest facilities, the budget decisions that meant corners were cut in ways that affected the people on screen rather than the people behind the desk, or the understanding, spoken or unspoken, that if you wanted to be part of something meaningful, you accepted the terms without making them a negotiation. Tony Berry, by all accounts from those who worked alongside him, was not a man who sulked or demanded. He was practical, warm, and committed. Those qualities made him invaluable. They also made him easy to lean on past the point of fairness. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that does not show on film. It lives in the body after the camera stops. It is the exhaustion of a man who has been performing emotional truth for 12 or 14 hours, who has eaten whatever was available, who has slept in accommodation that was functional rather than restorative, and who knows that tomorrow the same demand will be made again. People who were present on sets where Barry worked during this period have described, in general terms, a culture where the older, more experienced performers were expected to set the tone of endurance. If the veteran did not complain, the younger cast had no permission to complain either. The veteran became, without choosing it, the instrument of the system's patience. And Tony Barry was very good at patience. Too good, perhaps. His ability to absorb pressure and still deliver something genuine on screen was not just a personal virtue. It was a professional resource that others drew from without always acknowledging the withdrawal. The production got what it needed, the audience got what it loved, and the man in the middle got a credit, a fee that reflected the budget rather than the value, and a contract that reminded him, in careful legal language, that the experience was not his to describe publicly. Now consider what that means for a performer whose entire appeal was built on honesty. The audience trusted Tony Barry because he seemed incapable of performing a lie. Yet the professional structure around him demanded a particular kind of ongoing performance. The performance of contentment. The performance of gratitude. The performance of a man who had no grievances worth mentioning. Every interview in which he spoke warmly about a production, every public appearance in which he smiled beside the people who held the contracts was, according to this reading, a performance as demanding as anything he did on screen. And unlike his screen work, this performance had no end credits. Was there a moment when he nearly broke the silence? People who knew him in the years following his most celebrated work have suggested, carefully and without naming specific incidents, that there were times when the truth pressed close to the surface. A journalist would ask a question that touched the real territory. A public forum would create an opening. A younger actor would describe a bad experience, and Tony would listen with an expression that those nearby read as recognition rather than surprise. But the words that might have followed never came. The pause would close, the conversation would move, and the system would exhale quietly, having been protected once again by the decency of the man it had most reason to fear. Decency, in this context, is not a simple virtue. It is also a vulnerability. A man who cares about the crew, about the project, about the younger performers watching him, about the families depending on the production continuing, is a man who can be managed through his own conscience. You do not need to threaten such a person loudly. You only need to remind him gently of everything that could unravel if he speaks. The threat wears the face of responsibility, and a responsible man stays quiet. But there was a figure in Tony Barry's professional world who understood this dynamic better than most. Not a villain in the theatrical sense, not someone who announced their intentions, but the kind of smooth operator that every industry produces and every working performer eventually encounters. This was the person who always knew the right producer, who could get a call returned when others could not, who spoke the language of both art and commerce with equal fluency, and who appeared, at first, to be an ally. According to sources familiar with the social architecture around character actors of Barry's generation, such figures often positioned themselves as protectors. They would say, in effect, "Leave the difficult conversations to me. I know how these people think. I will handle it." The handling, however, had a price. The price was compliance. The price was the understanding that the difficult conversations would be handled by being made to disappear rather than being resolved. The grievance would be absorbed. The clause would be enforced. The performer would be steered away from the interview question, the public forum, the moment of potential honesty, and guided back toward the safer territory of gratitude and professionalism. And because this figure delivered results, because the phone did keep ringing and the work did keep coming, the arrangement felt like protection, even when it functioned as control. There is a specific incident that illustrates this dynamic, described in general terms by someone who was present in a professional capacity during a period of Tony Berry's career in the late 1980s. The details have been softened here to protect those still living, but the shape of the story is this. Berry had been part of a production that had, by the account of several people involved, treated its cast with a casualness that bordered on contempt. Payments had allegedly been delayed. Conditions had reportedly been poor. One performer was said to have been injured in a way that was handled quietly rather than officially. When a journalist, working on a profile of Berry, began asking questions that moved toward this territory, the conversation was interrupted. Not by Tony, by someone else in the room. The interruption was polite. It was framed as a scheduling concern. But the journalist understood, and Tony understood, and the person who interrupted understood, that the real message had been delivered without a word of it being spoken aloud. Afterward, according to the person who described this scene, Tony Berry sat for a moment in a way that suggested he was deciding something. Then he stood, thanked the journalist, and left. He did not look angry. He looked, in the words of the person present, like a man who had just been reminded of a rule he already knew. That expression, that particular resignation dressed as professionalism, is perhaps the most honest portrait of what the system demanded from him, and the system was not finished. As his career moved through the 1990s and into the years that followed, the pressures did not diminish. They changed shape. The independent spirit of earlier decades had given way to more corporate structures, more international co-productions, more sophisticated legal frameworks. The contracts grew longer. The confidentiality language grew more precise. The people across the table grew more practiced at making restrictions sound like standard procedure. For an actor whose body was also beginning to make its own demands, this tightening of the professional vice was particularly cruel. The melanoma that would eventually cost him part of his leg, a diagnosis that, according to some sources, came around 2007, was not yet the public fact it later became. But the body keeps its own accounts long before the diagnosis arrives in official language. Fatigue that does not lift. Pain that requires management. The quiet arithmetic of a person who is spending physical reserves that cannot be replenished at the same rate they are being drawn down. In that condition, the last thing a working actor needs is the additional burden of legal fear. Yet that is precisely what the contracts delivered. Because here is the mechanism that the system understood and exploited. A healthy, financially secure performer with strong representation and no immediate need for the next job can afford to push back against a bad clause. He can afford to say no, or to negotiate, or to walk away and wait for a better offer. But a performer who is managing health concerns, who needs the income, who is aware that his casting window is narrowing with age, who has seen what happens to actors labeled as difficult, does not have the same freedom. His signature on the confidentiality clause is not entirely voluntary. It is the signature of a man who has calculated the cost of refusal and found it too high. This is the architecture of coercion that never needs to announce itself. It does not require a raised voice or an explicit threat. It requires only that the performer understand his position clearly enough to make the calculation himself. The system does not need to say, "We will destroy you if you speak." It only needs to ensure that the performer can see, without being told, exactly what speaking would cost. Tony Berry, intelligent and experienced and deeply aware of how the industry worked, would have been capable of making that calculation very quickly. And the result of the calculation was silence. But silence accumulates. It does not simply sit still. Every year of silence becomes a year of the official story going unchallenged. Every interview in which the difficult questions were deflected became part of the public record. Every warm profile that described him as a beloved veteran without asking about the conditions that produced the work became another layer of the myth. And the myth, once thick enough, becomes its own form of imprisonment. Because now, if the truth were to emerge, it would not merely contradict a bad contract, it would contradict decades of public narrative. It would require the audience to revise not just their understanding of one production, but their understanding of an entire industry they had been encouraged to love. That is a very large thing to ask of a man who loved his audience. Tony Berry's relationship with the people who watched him was genuine. He did not perform affection for fans as a marketing strategy. He was, by every account, a person who found real meaning in the connection between a story told honestly and a stranger who needed to hear it. To shatter that connection, to force the audience into a confrontation with the machinery behind the warmth, would have felt to him like a betrayal.